So good morning and welcome to the second of our Advent series on Marilynne Robinson's Gilead. Last time we looked more at the positive part of the novel, the ability both the author has and the fictive voice of the novel, the one of the priest John Ames kind of embodies, the ability to see somehow the beauty, to give hospitality to the world and detect its beauty in all its kind of different aspects. And rightly so, at the end of a lecture last time, someone raised the issue of how to deal with the negative side of existence and of life. I myself, when I read the novel, especially Gilead for the first time, I read the whole kind of Gilead series. So there are, as you know, 4 novels. Gilead is the first one. And then the same story is told from the viewpoint of the different characters of the novel. So there is, I can't remember the order exactly, but there is Home, which is told from the viewpoint of Jack and Gloria. Then there is Lila, which is told from the viewpoint of the wife of the priest, and then there is Jack, which is told from the viewpoint of the wayward, in inverted commas, wayward character of Gilead. In itself, this is really fascinating because when you see things from the viewpoint of the voice of the narrator in Gilead, everything seems, at least at the beginning, all peaceful and all beautiful. And then when you start seeing the same story from the viewpoint of the other characters, you start realizing that there is much more texture and complexity to the story. Something which I completely missed when I read the novel for the first time was what lies behind the idyllic portrait which we find in Gilead, and particularly the subtlety of Marilynne Robinson's denunciation of, while she is amazing at capturing the beauty of the outlook on the world of this priest, this pastor. At the same time, she suggests already in Gilead something very sinister, incredibly sinister, and incredibly devious, which then becomes much more evident and is unfolded in the following novels. Basically, there is a subtext which I think is all the more powerful precisely because it is just suggested. And the very fact that it is something that we have almost to work out by ourselves is in itself a way of highlighting what is that makes this aspect, which we are going to unfold today, particularly damaging. So you would probably not know, if you read the novel, without a very solid knowledge of the historical context, that the set of the novel in 1956 corresponds exactly to the civil rights movement. In the novel, there is almost nothing about it, or there are only incredibly kind of flimsy details. And yet 1956 was one of the years in which the civil rights movement was at its apex. John Ames starts writing his letter only 2 years after the Brown versus Board of Education case, in which the, as you know, United States Supreme Court decided that they would reverse the policy of segregation and ordered the integration of African Americans into public schools. But John never mentions it. Then in addition, 1956 is the year that precedes the Montgomery bus boycott that inaugurated the civil rights movement. And also the fictitious letter, which is the substance, the base of the novel, was written a year after Emmett Till's tragic death, of which I will say something a bit later. Now, you can say, well, you know, a novel which is also a personal letter of this pastor to his son doesn't have to touch, you know, every topic or every subject. But then when you start seeing other aspects, you realize that this is really not so evident. Well, Iowa, which is the setting, so Gilead is based on a city, a real city, which is called Tabor, or Tabor, in Iowa. And Iowa at the time, so especially the century before, in 1846, was a state which had prohibited slavery and declared itself as a free state. It was heavily involved, Iowa, in civil rights movement. As 7 years prior to John's letter, the Iowa Supreme Court, in the case of State versus Katz, ruled it illegal to refuse service on the basis of race. So they were even ahead of the national movement. And John's obliviousness to all this is all the more suspect in light of the history of his own family. So I told you that Gilead is based on Tabor, and John's grandfather, so there is a moment in which in this letter, the Reverend John Ames starts talking about his father and his grandfather, who are really, especially his grandfather, a really colorful character. So the grandfather set up an abolitionist camp and worked for the Underground Railroads prior to the Civil War in order to help African Americans to escape the plight of slavery. John even mentions that his grandfather was an acquaintance of John Brown and Jim Lane, two of the most prominent abolitionists in the 19th century. Along with them, his grandfather participated in a violent political quarrel known as Bleeding Kansas, where he fought in the anti-slavery side. But both John and his father, so we have three generations of ministers here, his grandfather, his father, and himself. His grandfather was someone who was persuaded that social justice should be advanced with the use of violence, and he even brandished his weapon, his pistol, his gun, during services in church. And obviously we can be, have reservations about this. And yet at the same time, he had this deep sense that something had to be done to deal with the issue of slavery. And John and his father criticized the grandfather's vision. So the grandfather said that he had had a vision in which Jesus Christ had appeared to him and cautioned his use of violence to further the cause of the abolition of slavery. So the father first and John Ames, after they opposed this and moved away from the grandfather's ideology of attaining peace through violence. Okay, so we have someone who is deeply steeped into this issue, and this is something that has shaped the history of his family. Then there is the fact that when again, as I told you, the other novels give different, see the same story from different angles, and Home, which is, so there are in Gilead, there are these two priests who are very good friends. So there is John Ames, who is the guy who writes the letter, but there is also the Reverend Robert Boughton. So John Ames is a Congregationalist, and Robert Boughton is a Presbyterian. They are the head of the two most important congregations in the city, and they are friends. They've been friends for the whole of their lives. They meet together to discuss theology on a regular basis. They support each other, and the nemesis of John Ames in the novel is called Jack Boughton, is the son of Robert Boughton. And this Jack, who is the negative side, if you want, in this novel, had always been uncomfortable with something of the religiosity of his father and of John Ames. And this had manifested itself through a rebellious, extremely rebellious character who at one point has an affair with a girl. The girl is pregnant. It's a girl from a very, very poor background. And Jack, instead of taking responsibility, flees from the village and does not come back for 20 years. At the time, this was an extremely damaging and also scandalous thing, especially for the son of a pastor. So both John Ames and Robert Boughton have a huge kind of, are heartbroken, of course, and by this try to take care of the little girl, but then the little girl, because she's neglected by her mother, dies. So there is a real painful story which we learn little by little in the novel. Now, the friendship between these two ministers who represent mainstream Protestantism in this country, so the Congregationalist and the Presbyterian, the friendship between them is sustained by these theological conversations, and both of them, as we discover in Home, the other novel which focuses on the Boughtons, both of them are subscribers to The Christian Century, which was the liberal religious Protestant magazine. It still exists, which represents the Wheaton College mentality. And the Wheaton College is one of the most important, or used to be one of the most liberal Protestant seminaries who also espoused fully the anti-slavery mentality. So it appears that they read avidly the Christian Century, and during those years, the years in which the novel is set, the Christian Century was constantly talking about race issues and the duty of Christians to do something about it. Again, this is something that you have to know, you have to guess by piecing together all these little elements which I'm kind of giving to you now. Then, the race issue becomes really acute when Jack, so the wayward son who had left Gilead for 20 years, all of a sudden comes back and nobody understands why. And as it turns out, after a little bit, during his time away, he has met a woman, but he's a colored woman. And in those years, in those states, it was forbidden by law for a white man to be with a black woman, and even more so vice versa. And she herself, she's called Della. She's the daughter of a black Protestant minister. Okay, and the story of the way they met and the way they fell in love with each other is narrated in the last of the novels of the Gilead cycle, which is called Jack, which is an incredibly also beautiful, beautiful novel. So he comes back to Gilead to see whether this city, which has been at the forefront of the fight against slavery, this city which had been founded by people who had contributed to the Underground Railroad, etc., whether this city would be a place where he could move, to which he could move with his wife and his son. So he goes and talks to John Ames about this, but painfully in the novel we see that John Ames decides to ignore the problem, to not to do anything. So I'm going to read you some abstracts from the novel in number 5.2 to give a bit more flesh to what I've been describing to you so far. So at one point, towards the middle, it's almost towards the end of the novel, finally John Ames discovers why Jack has come back to the village. So he says, Jack Barton has a wife and a child. He showed me a picture of them. He only let me see it for half a minute, and then he took it back. I was slightly at a loss, which he must have expected, and still I could tell it was an effort for him not to take offense. You see, the wife is a colored woman. That did surprise me. Then, a bit further, there is a conversation between Jack and John Ames. I came here, said Jack, thinking I might find a way to live with my family here. I mean my wife and son. I've even thought it might be a pleasure to introduce Robert to my father. I would like him to know that I finally have something I can be proud of. He's a beautiful child, very bright, and believe me, is being brought up in the church. He wants to be a preacher. But now I see how feeble my father is. Also, Robert Barton, Jack's father, is ailing, is almost dying himself. And I don't want to kill him. I really don't. I have enough on my shoulders as it is. And we will see in a bit also that the reason why he would kill his father is because of his views on what should be the proper way of dealing with African American people. But then Jack said, what about this town? If we came here and got married, could we live here? Would people leave us alone? And John Ames replies, well, I didn't know the answer to that one either. I thought so. He said there was a fire in a Negro church. So a few years before the setting of the novel, there was a fire in the Negro church. John Ames recounts the fire as if it had been an accident. The reality is that it was almost certainly something which had been provocated or caused by people who wanted to get rid of the African American community. And as it happens, after the fire, the church was not rebuilt and all the black people left the city. So at the time where the novel is written, this city, which was based on anti-slavery sentiment, had become entirely white. All the black people had left. And this is how Jack says there was a fire at the Negro church. And John Ames replies, oh, that was a little nuisance fire, and it happened many years ago. Mm-hmm. And it has been many years since there was a Negro church. Then he says, of course there wasn't much I could say to that. He said, you have influence here. I said that might be true, but I couldn't promise to live long enough to make much use of it. I mentioned my heart. If you remember, John Ames is about to die because of his heart condition, and the reason why he writes that letter is to leave a kind of testament, a spiritual testament to his very young son. Just another couple of elements just to give you all these traits I collected that show the racial subtext of the novel. At the end of Gilead, John refers to Langston Hughes' poem. Langston Hughes was this very prominent representative of the Harlem Renaissance. The poem is called Harlem, about dreams and hopes drying away or exploding. So this is the poem, it's a very short poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? John Ames believes that hope deferred is still hope. This is how he concludes the book. So the reference to Langston Hughes' poem is really very, very kind of just suggested. I'm going to read the passage which is in number 7, which is the last sentence, or one of the last sentences of the book of Gilead. This whole town, says John Ames, does look like whatever hope becomes after it begins to weary a little, then weary a little more. But hope deferred is still hope. I love this town, he says. I think something of going into the ground here as a last wild gesture of love. I too will smoulder away the time until the great and general incandescence. So, I mean, hope deferred is still hope, he says. But as Langston Hughes' poem shows, a hope or a dream deferred does not lead to any resolution. It sags or it explodes, as Langston Hughes says. So these are, I just collected all these elements in one place so that you can start kind of seeing this subtext, which again, I mean, it had escaped me entirely during the first reading of this novel. Now, at number 9, we go a little bit further into this analysis. So Gilead operates in the vein of literary realism, fiction that captures white Christian indifference toward racial injustice in mid-20th century America. In a sense, it is true that a lot of white pastors and a lot of the mainstream Protestant intelligentsia joined Martin Luther King. But joining the protest was the easy part. What the white Protestant mainstream, even liberal, especially liberal elite or people failed to do was they fought against segregation, but they refused integration. And there is a scene which I will never forget. This happened 24 years ago. When I was at Oxford, I became very good friend with a monk. So we went to Paris together. He was at Oxford, a student at Oxford with me, and he was, a bit on the conservative side as a Roman Catholic, but he, certainly someone who was kind and generous and loving in all possible ways. And in Paris, we saw a black person, a black man who was going hand in hand with a white woman. And he made this passing comment, which I've never forgotten. He said to me, "Oh, this is strange." And I said, "Why is it strange?" "Oh, this is something you don't see in America." And that was it. That was all. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. The thing at the time, I knew very little about race issues in America. But that thing stayed with me. I've never forgotten that thing. And when I came over and I started to know America, etc., well before I moved here, I understood what it meant. And this was all the more shocking to me because it didn't come from someone who was a racist. This friend of mine was not a racist in any kind of way, but how ingrained in his mentality was the fact that integration is something that is strange. Okay? So the number 10, the erasure of race and skirting of racial issues is telling of one of America's greatest sins, its inability to move beyond its whiteness, to step over into the otherness of oppressed people groups. So there is this story you might be aware of, which is the controversy between Martin Luther King and a group of clergymen, white clergymen, who were also, like the friend I talked to you about, not racist. They wanted to do something against racism, but objected to Martin Luther King's methods. So they, number 11, whereas the non-violent component of Martin Luther King's program was not controversial, for Christians at least, the direct action agitated many Christians. In response to King's desegregation demonstrations in Alabama in 1963, a group of 8 clergymen published a statement criticizing King's direct action, arguing that the demonstrations were unwise and untimely. They go on to argue that such actions as incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. So with such a statement, the clergymen refused to acknowledge the inequity and oppression at the root of these racial tensions. And King's replies from the Birmingham jail, where he was at the time, saying, "We who engage in non-violent direct action are not creators of tensions. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive." King understands that the undertone of the clergyman's statement is one of avoidance, a dismissal of responsibility in favor of social order. And that is the big thing. And he says, Martin Luther King, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." So we can call this attitude as pacifism, a strategy used to avoid confrontation by hiding behind the mask of nonviolence. This avoidance perverts King's message of nonviolence in service of white respectability. In principle, pacifism opposes injustice, but in practice it avoids meaningful action. Now, in Gilead, John Ames and his father represent 2 generations of exactly this kind of pacifism that fails to the black citizens of Gilead and the community as a whole. Present-day Gilead has moved a long way away from the radical social consciousness of the grandfather. So, as I mentioned to you in 1502, John Ames's repeated dismissal of the black church's fire as a small fire and as a little nuisance highlights the fact that he refuses to fully engage the problematic reality of racial tension in Gilead. His disregard for the import of the incident punctuates his refusal to acknowledge the hatred that precipitated the fire. As the black citizens of Gilead leave town, there is no indication in Ames's narrative that any effort by the townspeople are made to prevent their departure. There is no urgency to work passionately for racial reconciliation. With a clear conscience that he was not the perpetrator of the church fire, Ames construes his inaction as acceptable action. Upon closure of the black church, which I mentioned to you earlier, an unnamed black pastor, we are told, brings Ames some flowers dug up from the church. Ames casually accepts the flowers, as casually as he would welcome a warm plate of food. He just mentions it. And then at some point he says, "Oh, we have to look after these flowers because they are important." But there is no reflection on the significance of this gesture. And even more damningly, he just notes at the end of the relating this anecdote that he didn't know the Negro pastor well. That's all. So this is part of the problem. Gilead was, as I told you, a desegregated town, certainly, but not an integrated community. So much so that, all the black people had left because they couldn't leave there. So they had not been violently opposed. They had not been, discriminated against, but just they couldn't breathe the air of the place. They had to go elsewhere. Martin Luther King clarifies the distinction between desegregation and integration when he explains desegregation breaks down the legal barriers and brings men together physically. Integration is a personal and intergroup feeling. Had true fellowship and communal bonding taken place between the races in Gilead, perhaps Ames would have had a relation with the black congregation, and perhaps his reaction to the fire at that church could have been more impassionate. Ultimately, it is easy for Ames and the citizens of Gilead to affirm their understanding of justice and sufficient action because they no longer have the presence of a black community to which they must be held accountable. In a place where we are safely away or distinct, and it's so interesting that even in a place like New York, which has been traditionally very, very liberal, but things might have changed a little bit now. But it's very evident that black people don't live with white people, and most of them have been safely put away from the places where they were not in the way of white respectability. Now, it is, I want to go to number 18, that the views of the white moderate clergymen, those opposing Martin Luther King, is shared by both John Ames and his friend Robert Boughton, appears more clearly in the other novel I mentioned to you, Home, that focuses on the Boughtons, which tells the story of the Boughton family. There are discussions between the pastor, this Robert Boughton, and his son Jack, who has married a black woman, on the issue of civil rights. Now I'm going to read these passages. They are chilling. They are really chilling. So they watch television together, Jack and his father. This is in number 18:1. On the screen, white police with riot sticks were pushing and dragging black demonstrators. They were dogs. His father said, "There's no reason to let that sort of trouble upset you. In 6 months, nobody will remember one thing about it." Jack said, "Some people will probably remember it." "No," says his father, "it wasn't so long ago that everybody was talking about Senator McCarthy, watching those fellows argue. It's television that makes things seem important, whether they are or not. Now you never hear a word about Senator McCarthy." Jack said, "Well, that's important, isn't it? I can't disagree. I don't know. I never admired him." Police were pushing the black crowd back with dogs, turning fire hoses on them. Jack said, "Jesus Christ." His father shifted his chair. "That kind of language has never been acceptable in this house." Jack said, "I," as if he had been about to say more, but he stopped himself. "Sorry." So the father is more shocked reacts more to the blasphemic language of the son that what is seeing on the television. On the screen, an official was declaring his intention to enforce the letter of the law, still in these situations. Jack said something under his breath, then glanced at his father. The old man said, "I do believe it is necessary to enforce the law. The Apostle Paul says we should do everything decently and in order. You can't have people running around in the streets like that." And then there is this other sentence. Jack must have taken his father to be in fact asleep, because when the news turned to the troubles in the south, he said softly again, "Jesus Christ." The old man roused himself. "What is it now?" "Oh, sorry," Jack said. "Sorry, it's Tuscaloosa. A colored woman wants to go to the University of Alabama. It appears they don't want her there." Jack laughed. "It sure doesn't look like it." His father watched for a moment, and then he said the classical sentence, "I have nothing against the colored people," okay? Which is a way of saying, what it says. I do think they are going to need to improve themselves, though, if they want to be accepted. I believe that is the only solution. I mean, this is really, this has everything. And these are things that I there is no attempt by Marilynne Robinson to draw the attention on these sentences. There is no attempt. She just kind of leaves these sentences there, and leaves the work to us to pick them up and to reconstruct the mentality of these people and what is being portrayed there. If you go to number 19, there is the reference I mentioned to you earlier to Emmett Till that comes into a conversation between the Jack Boughton and his father. The colored people, his father said, appear to me to be creating problems and obstacles for themselves with all this commotion. There's no reason for all this trouble. They bring it on themselves. Jack looked at him. He drew a long breath, then another. He asked softly. Remember, Jack is married to a colored woman, okay? But he doesn't say it to his father because and this is why he thinks, I can't tell him, otherwise this will kill him. And eventually decides to leave the city again, just before his father dies. Jack looked at him. He drew a long breath, then another. He asked softly, sorry, have you heard of Emmett Till? Emmett Till, wasn't he the Negro fellow that attacked the white woman? Jack said, he was a kid. He was 14. Somebody said he whistled at a white woman. His father said, I think there must have been more to it. Jack, as I remember, he was executed. There was a trial. Jack said, there was no trial. He was murdered. He was a child, and they murdered him, lynched him. He cleared his throat to recover control of his voice. Yes, that was upsetting. I had another memory of it. Jack said, we read different newspapers. That might be the difference. Still, parents have a responsibility. What? They bring children into a dangerous world, and they should do what they have to do to keep them safe. Jack cleared his throat, but they can't always. They might really want to. It's very hard. It's complicated. So you see, number 20, John Ames, his father, and Robert Boughton are accurate representations of some of America's white Christian leaders and mainstream Protestant culture during the mid-20th century and possibly currently. They cower from meaningful direct action, they miss the opportunity to use their authority effectively, and they retreat into a world of vast oblivion. As beloved as Ames, his father, and Boughton are in Gilead, they ultimately fall short of their spiritual responsibility to love, defend, and advocate for marginalized among them. Now you see, this is so troubling because when you read Gilead for the first time, as was my case, you are completely, you cannot not find John Ames so endearing, and Robert Boughton, and this life dedicated to a community and of preaching and seeing the beauty of creation and seeing all the things we described last time, and this ability to be grateful for everything, and this hospitality to creation, to every little details of life, seeing the presence of God in it, etc., etc. And it is like you are drawn into, this is what art is never, in whichever form, is never safe. Because the more you get kind of charmed and inspired by all this, wisdom and peace, the greater your shock is when you discover that this is just a way of avoid responsibility, of retreating into this right in many ways perception of reality, but at the cost of cutting off entirely another aspect and of forfeiting your moral responsibility. I just want to give you a couple of sentences from Rowan Williams' analysis of the Gilead series. We won't have time to read everything, but for me, what he says is that I'm going to read the first sentence in number 21. We like to define ourselves as good very often because we like to make sure where our boundaries are. Physically, really, effectively, because, again, the refusal of integration is a way of establishing boundaries. And within these boundaries, of course, I'm good. Of course, I can define what good is. I can assure myself that I'm good because I don't want to see anything other than what I have enclosed within these boundaries. And I have pushed away, or I've blinded myself to anything that might trouble, might question this kind of reassuring story I tell myself of how good I am. Gilead, number 22, is a town that has forgotten a great deal of its history, forgotten its radical and risk-taking edge. And so it has become good. It's become good in a way which is in fact toxic to those who don't happen to belong. And Rowan Williams says we have to move from a focus on goodness, or trying to, what makes us good, or persuade ourselves, or try to tell ourselves that we want to be good, etc., to a focus on solidarity, to what it means for us to be bound to one another and shaped by one another to the extent that one of us can be brought back into full healing relation with God without being brought back to one another. Number 25, John Ames overcomes a particular kind of frozen or damaged. Yeah, that's the thing, sorry, just a little sentence before I read this one. Now, this is, again, not the whole story, because something does happen in the novel towards the end, which is extremely beautiful, is that despite its inability to overcome this damaged and frozen sense of goodness, John Ames manages to get closer to Jack Bolton just before he leaves. And there is a scene of blessing and reconciliation towards the end of the novel, which is of an incredible beauty, and somehow suggests the way out. So there is no resolution, there is no redemption in a sense, at least for this aspect of the kind of refusal to take responsibility and to feel accountable for the people you have eliminated from you have put outside your boundaries. But there is at least the suggestion of what is the way forward. So I go back to this sentence, number 25. John Ames overcomes a particular kind of frozen or damaged or deficient goodness only when he discovers an unexpected solidarity with Jack. He allows himself to recognize that they belong together, discovers an unexpected solidarity with Jack. He allows himself to recognize that they belong together, not apart. And this is something I want to focus on next time. So next time I would really want to focus on the relationship between John Ames and Jack, because it is that relationship that prevents John Ames from reassuring himself that he is a good person. Because despite himself, he discovers increasingly how much animosity he has against him and how troubled he is by him. And the reasons why he is so troubled help him to be a bit more honest about himself. This is something we're going to see next time.